Hello, and welcome to Eloqua Office Hours, our monthly session covering marketing automation insights and solutions. Your questions drive office hours, so we appreciate those who submitted questions for today's session. We will cover those today. After we end, we'd appreciate your feedback through a brief survey to help us improve future sessions. This session will be recorded, and you'll receive the replay link via email tomorrow. We have a special offer to share at the end of today's session, so be sure to stick around. Now let's get started. I'm Sebastian Martinez, Account Director at Fourth Eye Marketing, and I'll be your host today. Our presenters today are Mark Lavelle, Fourth Eye Marketing's CEO, and joining Mark is Richard Holder, our Director of Marketing. He's a veteran Eloqua user with over a decade of hands-on experience. If you have any questions during today's presentation, and we hope that you do, please use the Q&A feature so we can keep everything organized. Feel free to ask questions about today's topics or suggest topics for future sessions. With that introduction, let me turn the time over to Mark, who will kick off today's presentations.
Thank you, Sebastian. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about preferences. I'm going to go ahead and move to the start screen here. Um, so Forethought Marketing has been working with Eloqua and Marketo for many years, and we've seen a lot of customers with a lot of different preference situations. There's some commonalities to what's happening with companies today. And first of all, from a privacy perspective, most customers understand that privacy is important. They know they're required to comply with the law, and a lot of people in marketing automation today even understand the law. They understand GDPR, they understand CCPR in California. They've got a decent handle on what needs to happen. And intellectually, they also understand that they want stronger personalization, that connecting customers with the messages those customers are looking for is important. They understand and they're confident that better personalization will result in better campaign results. The problem is they have trouble operationalizing these or connecting these two together. And so, where does this leave most companies in today's world? Well, number one, it leaves them with campaigns, running campaigns that are based on titles, company size, where the customer is located, what the customer's downloaded, if you're lucky, maybe what pages a customer has visited. But you're really doing what's called inference-based marketing. You're guessing at what the customer wants. You're guessing at what campaign the customer wants to fit into. You're hoping that since everybody sends emails, if you send emails, that'll be fine. And a lot of customers pray that, hey, if we send everything at the same time, we pick a really good time that'll work out for everybody. So there is another alternative, and campaigns like this, I almost think of the TV show Mad Men when I think of campaigns like this, because it might have worked well in the days of Mad Men. It might have worked well even in the days prior to 2020, the last decade. But today's customers are looking for more. For starters, they're looking for communication with them the way they want to be communicated. Some customers want to receive push communications via an application. They want to see the notifications in that application when they pull that application up, not in their texts, not in SMS, not in their emails. They want it in that app when they go into that app. Other customers, maybe the Generation Z, texts and direct messages are the exclusive way they communicate. Of course, they want to receive communications that way. Others are like, yeah, if it's a timed event, or you're promoting a football game and the football game is starting, or something is happening that's time sensitive. Yeah, I'll take text in those cases. But the rest of the time, I want to be reached another way. And if you can't accommodate that bifurcation of channel management for the right type of communication, for the right type of channel, hey, go away. You know, your brand is getting hurt as a company, and your messaging, your marketing is hurting. And then texts. Then there's people in this third category. Well, frankly, I fall into it. Texts? Are you kidding me? Please do not promote anything to me via texts. So channels are really important. And down here at the bottom, you'll notice it says there's a window. There is a unique opportunity right now for people who use channels, because communicating via the right channel, the right message, is a huge advantage over people who are still just blasting everything out via email. The next thing we want to talk about is frequency. Frequency is is a funny thing. And we have over here on the right-hand side this little curve, sort of a bell curve. And if we look at that green bar in the middle, it's probably very reasonable that most people want things on this sort of a frequency. Let's say that newsletter frequency is monthly. But some people might want it weekly, and some people might even want to be updated, to the minute, to the day on what's going on. For those people on this end of the spectrum, if you're communicating them with here in the middle, you're missing the opportunity to connect more with those customers. They're looking for more communications, and you're effectively wasting it. Simultaneously, a lot of people want less. Hey, you're a great company and everything, but I just don't need something every month. But you know what? Once a quarter or twice a year or once a year might work out. And if you match the frequency that they're looking for, then they'll be happy. If not, you're annoying them for really no reason there. And here's the problem. If you don't match what they're looking for from a frequency perspective and a channel perspective, and of course a messaging perspective, what are you doing? Well, you're potentially going to lose, they're going to opt out completely. You're going to lose them entirely. You're going to lose them all. So what we're trying to get away from is just generating generic campaigns, hoping that if you send emails, it'll be okay because everybody sends emails. And instead of praying that sending everything at the same time, what we want to do is get away from inference-based marketing and move towards customer-driven marketing. Now, we all know that customers should be the focus of what we do, what the customer wants, what works for the customer, meeting the customer where they are. That's what works. That's what's driven Amazon, for example, to want to be one of the top companies, if not the top company these days in the world. It's crazy, right? So how do we do that? Well, instead of hoping, guessing what a customer wants, we send them what they've said they want by giving them the by sending them the messages from the preferences that they've specifically chosen. We give them not hoping that email's the right channel, but helping them to communicate to the way they want by giving them their, if they want to be communicated to via a push message, via an application you have, or they want to be communicated to via a SMS message, or they want to be communicated via LinkedIn DM, you can choose the right channel. And you can not only choose the right channel for that person, you can choose the right channel for the type of message that that person wants to get. And finally, we have frequency. And frequency is making sure that we send, instead of sending everybody the right thing at the right time, we specifically respect where they are on that particular curve. If they want it more often, we give it to them more. If they want it less, we give it to them less. We meet the customer where they're at. We basically match the customer's desires. We move from campaign management, inference, guessing, hoping, praying based marketing to customer driven marketing, doing what they want, when they want, in the way that they want it. So this leaves us to kind of a section-based summary here. And that section-based summary is the new normal, the new market landscape, if you will. First of all, privacy is no longer optional. It's the law. GDPR, CCPA, I think there's now 17 states in the United States, and there's, it's something like 80 countries now have privacy regulations. So it's not an option. From a preferences perspective, when somebody opts in, when somebody opts out, when they choose something, you need an audit history that lets your legal department be able to prove, if it's ever necessary, that this is what this customer chose, this is the date and time they chose it, this is how they chose it, this was our consent language when they chose it. And for preferences in combination with for comply can do all of that. Audiences demand relevance. If they don't get relevance, then they just opt out. And we all know we've seen too many opt-outs in our world. So the way to do that is give people the right channel, give people the right frequency. Traditional opt-in, opt-out systems are simplistic. We need to give people the control over the channels, the frequency, the types of contents, and the experience types. So Forethought Marketing has a product that matches this. It's called For Preferences. One of the big problems that large organizations have is that they have preferences that they have companies that have been sort of grown and accumulated over time. Starting off with departments, obviously you have the marketing department and the preferences from a marketing perspective, but then you may have specialized sales preferences. You definitely may have specialized services preferences. People want to get stuff for this product, but not that product. They want to get this sort of information regarding updates or upgrades, but not that sort of information. So you've got service and product-based departments. You've got investors sometimes. Those are all from a departmental basis. And of course, we all know about acquisitions. We acquire this company, a whole new suite of preferences comes in. Someday they may be incorporated, but it may not be for quite a while. And even after they are incorporated, it's a different customer base. You want to probably keep many of those preferences separate so that after the incorporation of the acquisition, you can still give customers access to the specific information that they want. Um, so to do this on a corporate-wide basis, to comply with the law, you have to have a centralized system, one that takes all of these preferences, puts them together. In many countries and in many states, from a legality perspective, you at one point at least have to have all those preferences on one page, which, when you consider all the preferences that happen across your company, can be a challenge. So you want to pull those together. You want to have that granular control. You want to be able to synchronize this across to Eloqua, across to Marketo, across to your CRM system, across to your service system, any system that communicates to customers, investor communications. All of those preferences need to be synchronized back to them. All of those channel communications choices have to be synchronized as well. You want to have preference controls that enhance the personalization and increase the engagement. And basically, you want to empower your customers and respect your customers to enable them to allow you to communicate to them the way they want you to. How does this work from a product perspective? In For Preferences, we have a single unified preference repository, one source of truth for all communication choices, a separate combined database of all of your preferences and all of the customer choices for those preferences, and the dates and transactions when those choices occurred. No more silos in the investment area, or silos in services, or silos in this acquisition or that acquisition. No inconsistent enforcement that makes you run askew of the law or makes the customer feel like your company's right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. Granular controls that lets every user pick what they want from you exactly and precisely and gets away from the batch and blast. Allows you to avoid messaging unwanted messages across the channels, because when a department doesn't know what the communication rules are and doesn't have centralized preferences, oftentimes, and I'm sure you've all heard this, they'll say, let's just send it to everybody. Always a bad idea, right? Or usually almost always a bad idea. And lastly, you want auditability. You want the ability to make sure that every single preference setting, every single preference change is something that's trackable, so that from a legal and compliance perspective, you can prove that somebody got what they wanted. So from a summarization perspective here, what does this mean from a big picture perspective? A lot of companies today struggle to pull their preferences together. They've got them in many different silos. The result is a bunch of unsubscribes, more than is appropriate, more than is necessary. You're deprecating, hurting your brand when you don't talk to customers the way they want. Of course, there's compliance and legal risk in that situation, and you're wasting marketing money in that case. You're working harder for less communication, for less customer satisfaction. Preference management addresses that, and specifically our product For Preferences does. It empowers companies to meet these expectations with centralized, scalable preference and consent management integrated into your marketing operations. Sebastian, that's my portion. I will turn this back over to you.
Very good, Mark. Thank you. As a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A option. And we actually do have one question for now. It says, what are your thoughts on applying implicit preferences based on behavior versus explicit set by the user?
Great question. First of all, not a fan of inference, of using inferences when a customer sets their own preferences. The reason should be obvious. If a customer says what they want, you should trust them and believe them, and not believe that you or your algorithm or your people are smarter than your customers are. But if a customer hasn't set their preferences, and in a preference management system, you can track whether they've consciously set something or not, then inferences make sense. Then what happens when a customer goes to set their preferences? They can see what you've set for them, what they haven't. Again, assuming it's configured that way, and they can say, "Gosh, I don't know why the company thought I wanted that," or "I don't know why the company thought I wanted that often. I don't want that every month. But once a year, I wouldn't mind hearing from these guys." And so inference preferencing is great for customers who haven't set their own preferences.
Very good. Thanks, Mark. I don't see any other questions for now, so let's move on. I'll turn the time over to our next speaker, Richard Holder.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here with us today. As you might see or hear, I have a bit of a cold, and so my voice is a little scratchy. And if I go away for a second, that's because I'm grabbing a drink to get ready to go. Okay, so Mark just showed you why privacy and preferences matter and how they enable better personalization. I'll discuss how to prepare for and implement a robust preference solution in Eloqua. When we work with customers on preferences, we often see this scenario. They have an existing preference center, but it's mostly an opt-out solution that uses Eloqua's email groups and unsubscribe options. The preference center doesn't fully reflect the true scope of the company's offerings. If they are exploring a more robust preference center, some stakeholders are less enthusiastic about gathering requirements and design, reducing the potential for better personalization and robust segmentation. Perhaps this is why you're here today. So I'm going to be helping chart a more productive path for you. I want you to consider a paradigm shift for the role of preferences. Preferences are a prime source of first-party data, especially if you're planning for or using sophisticated AI-augmented analysis. Segmentation is your campaign entry filter. Respecting preferences can influence who gets included in a campaign, reducing unsubscribes. And it becomes more accurate the more you invite customers to take control and specify what they want and do not want from you. Adding frequency options can also reduce the number of unsubscribes. Treat the Manage Your Preference link as a moment to show you care. We suggest giving customers options and embracing not at this time as an option rather than opting out forever. And finally, this is critical. How you approach the planning phase often determines whether your preference center project succeeds or fails. So before I walk you through with the how, let me ask you some foundational questions. Because if you get this right, everything else falls into place. Think about these questions with your team, and I mean your extended team. This isn't something you figure out within marketing operations. Where are you in your preference journey right now? Be transparent with what's working and what's not. What do you actually send today, and what do you plan to send 12 months from now? Are you sending articles, webinar invites, events, research reports, surveys, something new in the future that you're not doing yet? How do you think about those categories? The answer becomes part of your taxonomy. It matters because everything downstream depends on how you've organized your thinking around your content. What does your system look like? Do you have a single Eloqua instance or multiple instances? Maybe you're split by region or business unit. If you have multiple instances, how do preferences seek across them? These are important architectural questions. How granular do preferences need to be? By topic, by geography, by product line, maybe by platform or communications channel, as Mark mentioned earlier? What preference attributes are necessary to capture? We've talked about frequency and content type, but is there anything else that that would deliver better value to your customers that they could choose through preferences? This is about being comprehensive in your thinking, even if you choose not to implement specific ideas. These questions define everything that comes after, so take time to explore them together. This exploration needs to happen with your whole team, as I mentioned before, not just marketing ops sitting in a room making decisions without other stakeholders. Everyone wants to be and needs to be in the room where it happens, to borrow from Hamilton. Marketing ops needs to understand how product teams think about segmentation and what campaigns look like in practice. Marketing needs to think through their content strategy and how preferences fit into it. How does your product roadmap affect your taxonomy? What things do you need in the future? Your legal and compliance team may have input on how preferences should work from a legal and risk standpoint. Teams that get this right are the ones that did this exploration together. It's also where you avoid discovering problems later. You're on the same page from the start. As you explore, discuss, debate, and make decisions, document it. I know it sounds tedious. It's exciting to be in planning mode, you want to move forward and you're coming up with all these ideas, but it's important to write everything down. If you don't, it'll hold you back. Document what is in scope and why. Many teams make the fatal mistake of not documenting what they considered but chose not to implement and why. Because 6 months from now, someone's going to ask, why didn't we capture preferences by region? Instead of re-arguing that decision for the third time, you could pull up your documentation and say, for example, we considered region. We reviewed our business model and content strategy and determined that regional granularity does not align with our current and planned operating model. Here's what we decided instead. Documentation reduces organizational friction. It saves you from revisiting the same decision over and over. It helps you remember the context that made it the best decision at the time. And if your business changes, and it will, you have a baseline. You can say, here's why we rejected that then. Are those reasons still valid, or does the business case look different now? A quick side note here. If permitted at your company, I strongly recommend using meeting transcripts and AI tools to help organize your discussions and decisions. But don't forget to review what the AI drafts before sharing. While AI is quite capable, people understand the context better and should always review the output from an AI. In Eloqua, segmentation lets you apply preferences at the entry point. As Mark talked about earlier about whether they've set their preferences, whether they've opt out, or whether it's unset, you have the flexibility to consider all of the attributes. Here's what's elegant. When a contact changes their preferences, the segment recalculates automatically. They enter campaigns based on the new preference state. It's dynamic, no manual moving people around. That's how you ensure campaigns target people interested in that topic. Once they're in the campaign, this is where you can implement frequency preferences and to help reduce unsubscribes, because you don't want to have just a single option of receiving and not receiving. You want to give them the option to receive, but at a slower pace, or maybe a faster pace, as Mark described, but you want to give them that control. You can implement decision steps to evaluate whatever they have specified. What is their frequency preference? Weekly contacts go down one path, monthly down another, and everyone else proceeds using the default cadence. Here are some mistakes to avoid. And some of these I'm repeating again, but they are worth going over again. First, making decisions without stakeholder alignment. Ops builds one thing, marketing expects something different, and legal's worried about compliance. Nobody's on the same page, leading to misalignment and rework. Second, discovering mid-implementation that you need something you didn't plan for. This is why you bring the greater group together, so you have a range of ideas and perspectives. Suddenly, you realize that you need a regional hierarchy that you didn't account for. Now you're stopping and reworking. Third, not documenting your decisions. 6 months later, a new stakeholder reproposes something you already decided against. Without documentation, you re-argue it from scratch, adding delays. And fourth, finding fundamental gaps in your structure after launch. I think we've all been there when we have that forehead slapping moment. Your taxonomy no longer aligns with your content strategy or product roadmap. Now you're revising segments and reworking campaigns. If you had started with the entire team and had those detailed discussions, that's the place where you want to uncover these. Avoid these by spending time up front on exploring and carefully documenting everything, not building, planning. So in summary, here's what works. And I want to tie this to something important. Bring your stakeholders together and explore those foundational questions. Step 2, map what you're trying to do, your content, your architecture, your data flow, and everyone agrees on the shared picture. Step 3, decide on your preference attributes based on what actually matters for your business. Don't over-engineer, but do capture everything that matters. And I understand that that can be in conflict, but that's where you have this robust discussion as a team and you make decisions and document them. And also, because we live in a privacy-centric world, don't capture what isn't necessary. So discuss that and decide if you're going to capture it or not and document it. Document those decisions. That's step 4. And the reasoning behind them, both the yeses and the nos. And finally, build, test, monitor, and measure, and then refine. And then you repeat the cycle. Now, here's the thing about all of this. If you follow these steps, you're investing time in gathering requirements and design planning up front. You're deciding what's most important for your business and documenting it. And critically, you're documenting your reasoning, both what's in scope and what's out of scope. Because when you do that work correctly, when you've explored, decided, documented, then the operational implementation follows naturally. It's thoughtful, iterative approach that starts with clarity and delivers a design that everyone understands. Thank you. And with that, let me turn back to Sebastian for questions.
Very good, Richard. Thank you. As a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A option, just like Anne just did. And we've got this question. Hi, is it absolutely mandatory to use email group objects to build, collect, and process technically the preferences in a map? What are the pros and cons using email groups object?
So there's kind of 2 questions there. Let me take the second one there. So email groups are the default option inside of Eloqua. They are great for controlling opt-outs and perhaps opt-ins, but not as much. If you do surface your preferences page or the standard Eloqua preference page, that can be a place where you can opt in. But there's not as much flexibility with groups. And one of the challenges we see that as companies evolve, especially if they've had an Eloqua system for a number of years, that the groups sort of get out of control. Instead of, a dozen or so that are quite well defined, you have 100 or more of these groups. Some of them are actually being used and some of them are not. So it becomes a muddle there. So that can be a challenge. And if you don't mind, Sebastian, could you remind me the first question?
Sure. Is it absolutely mandatory to use email group objects to build, collect, and process technically the preferences in a map?
So, like I said, it's not absolutely required, but I think it's a good part of the entire equation. You could have, like we do with for preferences, and some customers, we have a combination of very detailed preferences that are stored in custom objects that has, the level of detail that's required in order to have a very robust portfolio that you offer where customers are asking about cat food, but not asking about diapers and so forth, if that's as robust as you want, or if you have some regional options. At the same time, you can backstop those with some groups to help with your segmentation so you opt in or opt out that way. But the more complex your requirements get, the more likely you are going to need something more robust than the out-of-the-box solution from Eloqua and just groups.
Yep, exactly. Groups is a great place to start. Richard, you said something in your presentation that I thought I might add a little bit too. You said, paraphrasing, of course, align your preferences with your taxonomy, your strategy, and your roadmap. And I don't disagree with that at all. But there is something else I'd like to add to it, and that is if you are a customer focused or you want to be a customer focused organization, one of the things also to do is to ask your customers what their preferences, what sort of things they want from you. How often should you send it? How do they want to receive it? If you ask your customers that information, sometimes you'll get some fascinating answers that when you look at your strategy and when you look at what your customers are saying, they don't quite match up. And the reason they don't match up is because your strategy or perhaps your messaging, what you're planning to do is not in line with what your customers really need. And so going to your customers for your preferences, frequency, channel, and so forth is I think incredibly valuable. It all comes back to respecting your customers and what they're looking for from you.
I completely agree. Using the opportunity to invite them to set their preferences because you care, and being in front of them, not just have it be a reactive thing. I think that's an excellent way to approach it. Okay, next question.
Okay, very good. And Anne, we'll be reaching out to you separately just to make sure that this was clear and we can set up a quick call to discuss further. Okay, next question from Matthew. It says, how can we handle multiple brands with individual preference experiences that must not cross over, but we still want to enable an intermediate unsubscribe page for each brand? We currently use email groups and want to avoid single-click unsubscribes from bots and spam checkers.
Yeah, bots and spam checkers, these are great tools for companies to protect themselves from things, but they're the bane of us email marketers because you can send something to somebody and then suddenly you're getting a lot of opens and a lot of clicks, and even sometimes they're opting out automatically, which is not what you want to do. And in your particular case, where you say you have multiple brands with individual preferences that you don't want to cross over, that's a very good use case to move beyond the standard Eloqua groups, even if you have a branded Eloqua instance, because it gets really complex to manage that. If you want customers from brand A to only see the preference page for brand A, you need that kind of control in your communication, in the links you provide them for opt-out, and that will be very different than brand B. So you need that control and that flexibility. It's certainly possible, and For Preferences is designed around that as one example there. And companies who are trying to do this today with other solutions are almost always creating custom preference pages in JavaScript and HTML and so forth. So
Yeah, in fact, Richard, if you'll stop sharing, I can actually share a little bit on something along those
sure.
lines. Tell me when you guys can see my screen.
Not yet. There we go.
Any minute? Okay. So this is four comply, four preferences, and four segments running in the user interface here. And this is the four preferences dashboard here. You can have different dashlets and so forth. One of the things you can do in four preferences is you can choose a business unit. And so everything within the four preferences system is set up to be configurable by business unit. And you can keep these business units in terms of what they can do and change completely focused within their domain. So if you have a business unit for energy and power and another for aviation and airspace, you can keep them completely separated. And so those pages you're looking for, if we go down to look at preference pages, we can see that, some pages might be for one business unit and some might be for another. And then one page, and I don't know that I have a good example here, could be for all of them, which is something often companies don't want to do, but unfortunately they're required by law to have somewhere. So I'm a big fan of per brand or per subgroup or per department preference pages. And then at the bottom of that page, you have to have a link that says for all preferences possible at whatever corporation, click here. And that goes to a database where, not a database, but a preference page. It has all the preference pages that are expandable by brand and group. So for preferences allows you to have preference pages broken out by business unit. It also allows you to have a complete database of preferences, and all of those preferences can be sorted by business unit or filtered by business unit so that you can work with just one particular business unit's worth of preferences if you want to. You set up those business units, they're completely configurable by you. And then, again, all of your frequencies, all of your channels, all of your additional pieces of information that different business units might need to have, all of that's trackable and centralized within one system that you can then go up and see your dashboards on and see your results on and so forth. So I hope that answers your question. Any other
All right.
questions?
Yeah. In fact, we have two
Sorry,
more.
Sebastian, stepping on your toes there.
No problem. We have two more. This one reads, is there an ideal way to export email group membership directly via Eloqua's API to Data Lake? We are having to maintain custom shared lists for removed from group and added to email group, which adds complexity that the list ops need to match groups. Our customer data platform reads shared list ID membership so they can avoid pushing segments with contacts it thinks it is subscribed. If it's easier, Mark, for you to address this
That sounds
separately,
almost like a
directly.
consulting level question. I'm not sure we can answer it in the 16 seconds that we have here. But certainly getting information from email groups out because of the somewhat, I won't say unusual, but the layered structure of email groups, it is a common question what you're asking there, and we can answer it.
Okay,
Yeah,
so we will address that via email separately.
Did
I
you
was
have
just
any
going to
quick?
add that Eloqua has a very robust API, and we're experts at using it. So if we brought in some of our technical team, they would be able to answer that question, and we'll follow up with you.
Yeah, probably could do that
Okay,
via a cloud app.
we have one last question, but it is also a bit long. Should we go through it right here with you guys, or separately? I can
Well, why
read
don't you
through
read
it.
it? We'll find out.
Okay, we're in a multi-brand, single-instance Eloqua environment. Are there any examples you're aware of where a single intermediate unsubscribe lander can work? Even our sending domains are different, so we have discounted this option. But maybe there is a benefit we're missing? We are leaning toward the creation of multiple custom landers hard-coded in each email group footer to keep the unsubscribe branded, and only for the group they're unsubbing from. Currently, our emails are a bit unprotected from bot click, so we are looking to stop automated bots from unsubbing our customers in each group by introducing a confirm unsubscription page.
Okay, so again, I'm not going to be able to fully answer this fairly deep question with, I think, several questions actually embedded. I can say for starters that I would certainly not have a direct unsubscribe link at the bottom of an email. You want that link at the bottom of an email to go to a page with multiple other choices for two reasons. One is you don't want the bot to just go, oh, there's an unsubscribe, click on it. You don't want that to happen just for obvious reasons. The second reason is you don't want people to do that. And related to that is when the person does that and goes to a preference page, you'll sometimes get a 30 or 40% what we call opt back in. Somebody clicks on opt out, they go to a page and then they look at the page and they go, oh, I didn't know I had the frequency option of going from weekly to quarterly. That solves my problem. And so the person opts out of weekly, but they opt back into quarterly. So I would not put at the bottom of a page something that just straight away opts you out, unless it's required by law. And I don't think it is anywhere right now. I would definitely not do that. And that's probably as deep as I can go down that rabbit hole in this conversation. There's certainly a longer conversation possible behind that question. I guarantee it.
All right, we have a question that just came in, and it reads, does the preference solution for forethought marketing have a native integration with Eloqua, meaning no complicated HTTP API calls?
Yes, it has a cloud app that directly allows you to move information between the two systems. It uses hard to understand API calls behind the scenes, but you don't have to see them at all. If you're familiar with Eloqua, and it sounds like you are, you can have the app on the left-hand side. You can drag it over, you configure it, and it moves the data.
Very good. And those are all the questions that we have for now. I'll leave 5 seconds here to see if anyone else wants to submit their question.
Are you going to hum the Jeopardy tune, Richard, or shall I?
Mm, mm,
Not
mm,
me.
mm.
Sebastian is. Okay.
All right, so that's all the questions that we have for today.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Before you go,